So I chose to do my presentation on the Jacob Stillman article. The main focus of the paper was to assess the rationale for the new prescribed THC blood concentration levels for impaired driving and the tools used to assess impairment and to assess their effectiveness, essentially. Um, so first starts off with outlining what the actual legislation is and the appropriate blood THC concentration levels. Section 2 is the enforcement. So it's very similar to alcohol in that um, with alcohol, there has to be first some sort of sign of impairment to actually pull someone over, or to actually test for uh, blood alcohol concentration levels. So so you have to smell alcohol in the person's breath, or they have to be driving recklessly. Um, they have a pass, warn, fail system, so they'll blow into a device. You pass, it'll essentially give a reading, and it'll advise the officer as to what to do to move forward. So if it's warn, for example, they'll then do physical tests, and it's at the officer's discretion after that to either let them go or not. So if they fail that test, then they get arrested and they get brought to the police station and they have to do legitimate tests where they blow into a breathalyzer and get the reading. So with cannabis, it's very similar, except it's a physical coordination test first, if there's signs of impairment, and then a drug screening test. And the drug screening device is you spit into a tube, and it'll give your reading. And then if you have over, then they'll bring you to the station, and they'll do a blood or urine sample test that has to be tested at a lab. So they then talk about field sobriety tests, which are the physical tests. They talk about how there's a lot of conflict with having these field sobriety tests. First of all, because it's hard to determine whether or not someone's impaired with cannabis because there's no objectifiable criteria that you can use to assess someone else. So there's no checklist that you can use. With alcohol, there is this checklist for the most part. There's objectifiable and verifiable characteristics of people who are intoxicated. So that's going to include a strong smell, a strong odor, slurred speech, etc. Right? Cannabis doesn't have that. So this essentially makes actually determining impairment extremely difficult for officers. This is compounded with the lack of knowledge and experience with cannabis that exists within police culture currently because it is so new. This, for one, opens the door to overreach, for police overreach, as police conduct can't be evaluated based on their action because there is no objectifiable criteria. So, for example, if they say, hey, I had this suspicion because they were acting this way, right? Let's say they're acting this way. If there's no criteria under cannabis that would make it seem like, okay, if they're acting this way, it doesn't add up that they were intoxicated, right, with cannabis. But there is no criteria, which means that you can't assess police officers' conduct and their ability to actually do these tests because there is no criteria, which means they can't be tested properly. Also, it under the laws, the actual person doesn't have to be impaired to justify the search, and the officer doesn't. So essentially, this means that the officer just needs to think that there's a presence of the drug in your system to actually pull you over. So the main issues with the field sobriety test, besides confirmation bias, and that they're not accountable for variability in the population, is that it's hard to determine impairment, which means that the officer's actions cannot be validated and they can't be contested, which means that people can have their rights violated without having the ability to actually question the police because it's based on their reasonable suspicion, because there's no objective criteria to actually assessing being high, right? They then talk about the roadside screening test. So the test is essentially you spit into a tube, and then they test the THC levels. So the reliability of the device has been proven. people are incapable of actually producing the saliva necessary, this could actually result in failure to produce charges. That's completely unfair, given that they just can't abide by the test when they had the intention to. The second problem is that cannabis is primarily inhaled, and when it's inhaled, the THC levels rise in your mouth for a certain period of time. So it could produce false results because you may not actually have that THC level concentration in your blood, but it could make it seem like you do, and so it could make you have to go to the station and then get your blood tested. So essentially, it further subjects you to unjust practices and intrusive practices to test blood concentration, like urine samples and blood tests, which is against the right to safety and security. Section 5, they discussed how the actual limit that they set out is problematic. So there's a consensus that driving is risky, but the limit itself is controversial because the actual data collection to evaluate blood concentration after accidents is inconsistent. So it's hard to create a basis as to what level is too much. It's hard to do experiments. It's hard to attribute meaning to data since testing is a lot more difficult, and the testing itself has to be done in the lab, which costs a lot more money. It's more difficult to do than just have the device and screen it like alcohol. So essentially, estimates of the risk for a certain THC concentration level are questionable in validity and reliability. So that makes it questionable as to what the limit is and what it can be, which essentially means that this could be an unfair level, meaning that people could have their rights infringed and could end up in jail for no reason. So another problem is that blood THC levels drop rapidly, although the effects last. So that could mean that if you tested someone and they seem fine and they don't test over, that can mean that they could be driving impaired without facing the consequences, which is extremely dangerous to the population and risky, which makes the limit controversial itself. Also, chronic users have a buildup of THC in their fatty tissues, so it may come out in their blood, but they may not be intoxicated. They may not have smoked. They may have smoked the night before, but it could be built up over time, right? So that could be problematic in putting people in jail for, again, no reason and for unfair reasons. Also, the amount of time it takes to get a test after being done with driving is a lot of time because they have to drive into the station, they have to take the blood or the urine, and they have to go get a test in a lab, which means that it could drop off. I mean, people actually get off who are impaired. Finally, the limit doesn't take into account tolerance. So you may be over the THC limit, but you may not be impaired. For chronic users, you may have a lot of THC in your system, but you're used to it and you don't feel the side effects, and so you may be okay to drive. But that doesn't take it into account in the laws, which could again end up in a lot of problematic circumstances where people are imprisoned for not driving impaired. So they're actually imprisoning people simply for consuming cannabis and driving. Whereas there is a right to consume your cannabis and drive just under a certain limit, but the limit itself seems to be extremely problematic. So I kind of wanted in my questions, in the discussion, I wanted to focus more on what control this gives on the population and how it's unfair control. So I was going to preface it by saying that most people have negative views towards driving under the influence of any drug, and with legalization, many people question the danger it poses to other drivers. So while driving intoxicated is dangerous, as discussed above, the current measures to test are unreliable, and levels of intoxications are difficult to determine as dangerous. So in light of all of this, I wanted to ask if they thought that the legislation and methods of testing, as is meant to truly stop impaired driving, or simply is it a measure to hold the government accountable to the public by restricting levels in some way? Because as you can see, chronic users can test over but not be impaired, right? And so that's not fair to the chronic user, but they have to do something. They have to implement some sort of restriction in some way, right? So what is the true purpose behind it if it's not fully based in scientific research? The next thing I wanted to ask was, under this precinct, Do you think that the ability to search a vehicle and arrest the individual after finding they are over the legal limit is justifiable, even if the tests are not reliable? So, is it fair for the police to have this control, even though the tests aren't reliable? Under this, I wanted to say, do you think that it's fair that certain populations have their rights infringed as a result of these laws, in the interest of public protection? So, for example, medicinal cannabis users, right? Police just have to, first of all, the chronic cannabis use and testing over is important, but also if police know that someone's a chronic cannabis user, they can pull them over and just think they might be high and then subject them to those tests. So is that fair? I also want to ask, is it fair to implement unreliable laws and implement control mechanisms that are not based in reliable scientific research? Again, is it worth the sacrifice for public protection? And then finally, I wanted to ask, do you think the laws will produce greater protection of the public more, or result in more ability to police to intrude on other rights? So in other words, are the laws in the best interest for the public or for the police? And so I kind of wanted to focus on, again, the control mechanisms and if they're fair, but also if is it ultimately protecting the public? It's supposed to protect the public. Is it ultimately doing that with all these holes and unreliable testing abilities as well as limits? Is it actually fair? And so, yeah, that's what I'm going to cover. Thanks.